It's incredible to think that because of God's work here in this world and here in this community and here in this church and through our lives, that there is no limit to the potential that he sees within this community. And the potential is this. You see, this is our mission as a church: to help people know Jesus, to help people grow and follow him, and to help people go, multiply followers of Christ, and help others to do the same. And so we're excited as we look to the future as a church, and as we look towards this building becoming a reality in the near future, not in some far off date, but in the next 3 years. As we look forward to seeing this become a reality, we're excited about what's happening. Last week we talked a little bit about David, about his life, how he made plans for a God-honoring future. And this future that he looked forward to was a legacy that was going to outlive him, that he wasn't even going to be able to see, to be a part of. But we saw that the people in that day, and we want to copy that example, gave not out of guilt, but willingly and in a way that produced joy. And David concludes after everyone had given by recognizing everything, God, that we have comes from you, and we're just giving what you have entrusted to us in response to your generosity. And in a similar way, as we look to the future over the next few years here, we're excited to be involved in giving back what God has given us, to be a part of what God is doing here and now, but also long into the future and in many other places, in other parts of the world as well. This week, as we launch forward with this series, we had a holiday, we had 2 holidays this week. One of them I bet you've heard of and maybe celebrated. The other one you more than likely missed. I didn't realize when it was until I was actually preparing for this Sunday. The first one, I lived in the Chicago area for a while, and so the river would always get dyed green in celebration of St. Patrick's Day, right? And so as a good Green Bay Packer fan, I'm okay with St. Patty's Day because everybody gets to wear green and celebrate the Packers with me. I don't know if that's why you wore green or not, but go Packers, right? And then there's another holiday, maybe that you didn't know about, but it was actually it was celebrated right at the same time on that same Thursday as St. Patty's Day. It started on sunset of Wednesday and ended at sunset of Thursday. And it's celebrated with, some strange-looking triangular types of foods. It's celebrated with dressing up. It's actually, I show you this picture, and if you change the caption at the top, you'd say Halloween costumes, right? But it's Purim costumes. What's that about? What's Purim? Maybe you've never heard of it. Maybe you living in this area with a lot of Jewish influence, maybe you do know about this festival, this celebration that was on Wednesday and Thursday as well at the same time as St. Patty's Day. Here are the 4 things that are required, or the tasks of how to celebrate Purim. Send gift baskets of food and candy to friends and family, give out all these things, give to the poor, eat a festival meal, and listen to 2 public readings of the book of Megillah. I don't know how to pronounce it, but I do know how to pronounce the one in my Bible that's actually written in English, and that's called Esther. And we find that in our own Bibles, there's a book called Esther that tells the same story, that is where the celebration of Purim comes from, that was celebrated this last week, overlapping a bit with the holiday of St. Patrick's Day. And this same event is found in our Bibles, and we're going to look at it a little bit today, the celebration that is still happening now. Today, we're just going to focus in on Esther chapter 4. I'll have that on the screen as well. But since we're jumping in partway through the story, I need to give us a little bit of a background where we jump into chapter 4. In the book of Esther, just to start from where we were last week, remember David was king of Israel, and he had some sons and so forth as kings. Now, the nation of Israel stopped obeying God. They did things their way. And God not only allowed, but he sent conquerors to punish and to exile the people from the land of Israel, because they'd abandoned him. They weren't doing things his way, and he'd warned them over and over. He'd sent prophet and deliverer after person to say, turn back to God. And they did things their way anyway. And so they found themselves, many of them, exiled into what would be modern day, basically on the border between modern day Iraq and Iran. Many of the people from Israel had been deported to there. And at the setting of the time of Esther, there's a king named Xerxes, or Ahasuerus, who was the king at that time, known by different names, of a kingdom that stretched from the edges of India to northern Egypt. And so he was such a powerful king that he decided to throw a 180-day feast to show off his wealth, to show off his grandeur. And in the midst of this feast, he called for the queen to come in her crown and kind of do a one-person beauty pageant of sorts in the midst of this drunken crowd. And she says, I'm not going to do that. And the king's advisors say, man, if she stands up to you, everybody's wives are going to stand up to him. And it's, this kingdom could fall apart if you let this go. And he says, fine, she's fired. She's out. She's not queen anymore. And then he started to regret his decision a few days later once he'd sobered up and things were kind of back to him. Like, man, that didn't go very well. And so his advisors say, well, it's time to get a new queen. And they say, all right, how do you propose doing that? And so his advisors come up with this brilliant plan. They say, we're going to have a beauty pageant where the most beautiful women in all of the land are going to come, and they're going to be beautified with these treatments for weeks and months, and then you're going to be able to have your pick. And how you're going to do it is every day one of them is going to come to you, spend the night with you, and be added to your concubine, and you just get to pick because you're the king. And if he thought that was a good idea. And so that's how the plan went. And all these women were gathered from all over the kingdom for this king to be able to choose from who would be the next queen. And so there was one Jewish woman named Hadassah or Esther who lived actually right in that same area. She was added and a part of this search for a queen. And she is presented to the king. She is the one that he ends up choosing to be the queen in replacement of the previous one. After all of these women that he'd seen at his palace, she is a Jew, but she keeps it a secret. At the advice of her older cousin, Mordecai. Mordecai, I guess, was old enough that he'd adopted her. Apparently, her parents had died, and so as the older cousin, he'd adopted his younger cousin, Hadassah, or Esther. And so she was trusting his counsel, and he was advising her about what to do. He says, don't tell anybody you're a Jew. That might go badly for you. And so she kept it a secret. But now here she was, a queen by title, without a lot of power or authority, but queen nevertheless. There in this kingdom where there'd been a lot of turmoil in some ways. Now, at that same time that those things were happening, there was another man who had some power and some prominence there in that kingdom. He had the ear of the king. His name was Haman. Now, he did not like Mordecai. He hated Mordecai. In fact, he hated him so much that when he found out Mordecai was a Jew, he says, I'm just going to kill all the Jews to get rid of him and punish him and just show everybody how much I hate him and his people. And so he came up with this plan, and he bribed the king with a whole bunch of silver to say, hey, there's this people group who are just awful, and I'll give you all the silver if you let me kill them. And the king's like, well, you're going to give me a bunch of silver. Okay, fine, let's do it. And they cast lots, or Purim, to figure out what day all these people would be killed. And so the lots were cast, and they decided this is the day that these people will be killed. One important detail. As we set up Esther as queen, as we set up Haman, who wants all the Jews dead, and we have this Mordecai. Mordecai discovered a plot against the king. He found out some guards wanted to have him killed, and so he passed on word to Esther, who was queen, who spread the word, had these men found, investigated, and convicted of treason, and it was recorded that Mordecai had discovered the plot. So we've got this triangle of sorts, that Esther is queen, Haman wants all the Jews dead, and Mordecai, as a Jew, has just saved the king's life, and it's been recorded, but nothing has been done about it. And that's where we jump in Esther chapter 4, and the news has just been given out that the people of Israel, the Jews, are all going to be killed because Haman has bribed the king. And here's what it says, starting in verse 8. He, Mordecai, also gave him, and this is a messenger of Esther, it gave him, the messenger, a copy of the text of the edict for their annihilation, the Jewish annihilation, which had been published in Susa to show to Esther and explain to her. And he, Mordecai, told him to urge her to go into the king's presence to beg for mercy and plead with him for her people. So Mordecai says, the news is that we're all going to die. The news is that Haman wants us dead, and here's the proof, here's the edict that we have all been executed, and on this day, we're going to die. Take this message to the queen. Take this message to Esther. She's the queen. Tell her to go to the king and say, please don't let this happen. Go to him and beg for mercy and plead that something would be done. Verse 9. Hathach, this is the messenger that Mordecai was sending, went back and reported to Esther what Mordecai had said. Then she, Queen Esther, instructed him to say to Mordecai. So she's sending this message back. They're not face to face. It just wasn't proper in those days. She's royalty. He's stuck outside. He's a messenger. He's a Jew. And so Mordecai's out there, and there's this guy running in between. He goes to Esther and says, we're all going to die. Do something. And she sends a message back to Mordecai, and she says this in verse 11. All the king's officials and the people of the royal provinces know that for any man or woman who approaches the king in the inner court without being summoned, the king has but one law. Here's the law, that he be put to death. Anybody who goes to see the king, if the king hasn't called him, dies. That's the law, Esther says. Everybody knows that. You want me to go talk to him? What are you, crazy? And she says the one exception to this is for the king to extend the golden scepter to him and spare his life. But 30 days have passed since I was called to go to the king. It's been 30 days since I've seen the king. And what you want me to do is go into that court and say, hey, please spare my people. That's death. If he doesn't do the one and only thing that will save me and extend that scepter to me, I'm gone. It's been 30 days. I don't know what kind of mood he's in. I mean, this guy seems like he's kind of a moody guy. You don't want to show up at the wrong time. Maybe he's in a bad mood today. Maybe he's got there's something in our relationship that I don't know about, and I don't want to walk in there and face death if I just catch him on a bad day or in the wrong mood. And so she's basically saying taking action here has risk. There is some big risk for me, says Esther, if I go in there unannounced and uninvited. I could die. And we recognize in many areas of life that taking action carries with it a certain amount of risk. There's a certain amount of risk every time you get in your car to go somewhere. There's a certain amount of a risk and about every kind of action that you take. Everywhere you go, everything you do. And as we talk about this building project and go, man, look at what God could do in the future. And we go, how might I be a part of it or not? And you go, there's some risk involved with being a part of that. I mean, if you give towards this new building's unlimited potential, you could be executed by a Babylonian king. Not really. Different risk from that which Esther was facing, right? But there's risk nevertheless, because it's not free. You can't spend the same dollar twice. Inflation, political uncertainty, unknowns in our future as individuals, as a nation, there are many potential risks as we talk about what God can do here and consider whether or not we want to be involved and in what ways to be involved. There's always a risk. There's always a cost for any kind of change, and the question is always this: is the cost of change greater than or less than the cost of staying the same? And if we believe the cost is greater of staying the same than it is to change, that's what motivates us to change. But if we feel like the cost of change is too risky, then normally we don't like to make a change, and so we aim for safety. And so Esther felt as though the risk of taking action in this circumstance was a greater risk than not taking action, of remaining in her chambers, of remaining as queen, of not going to see the king. And so essentially she's telling Mordecai, good idea, but find a new plan, because I don't want to die. And I think Mordecai's response to her, challenge to her, is valuable not just in this instance or in this story, but is valuable for us in our lives as we consider how we respond to the call of God, as we consider how we take risk or don't take a risk. Here's what it says in verse 12. When Esther's words were reported to Mordecai, he sent back this answer. So again, a message is sent. Do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. It says, hoping to avoid risk does not negate risk. You see, two things are true. Taking action has risk, and inaction has risk. If we put it in an exercise term, we could say you might get hurt if you exercise. If you do this exercise, that exercise, I mean, maybe you'll stress your heart and you'll do this and that. But on the other hand, if we just sit on the couch all day, there are risks that come from no exercise. And there are opposite risks, but maybe they deal with our heart again not being in good enough shape. And some problems that we deal with there, that taking action has risk, and yet inaction has a different kind of risk. I know a lot of times in life we try to insulate ourselves from risk, but we never can fully get rid of it. There's risk with every action that we take. There's risk in relationships we make, in people we trust, in marriages and in kids. Things that are positive and yet things that also carry with them risk of harm and of hurt and of pain and heartache. And every day we make decisions about how we act when it comes to risk. Do we take action? Do we avoid action? And there are risks with both. We have an opportunity as we look to the future to risk for a better future. For a future that takes the name of Jesus in our community and expands it in ways that we have not been able to in the past. It's a risk. And in a similar way, there are risks that we can embrace by doing nothing. See, Mordecai goes on and he says this to Esther. He says, if you remain silent at this time, if you do nothing, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place, but you and your father's family will perish. Mordecai's message to Queen Esther is, you could do nothing. God will still do something. God will still save his people, but here's what the risk is. You won't be a part of it. It will still happen, but not with you. See, I think the story of Esther would not be one that would be remembered if she did not answer the call. If she did not act when presented with the opportunity. See, avoiding God's calling does not negate God's calling. God will act, God will move, and God will do what he's planned to do. The question is not whether God will still do it. The question is whether you and I will be involved in what God is doing in this world. And we encounter these circumstances where sometimes maybe we're with a friend and we go, man, I should say something. And we go, and maybe I stay quiet and miss the opportunity to be involved in what God is doing. And maybe there's a friend of yours that comes to know Jesus and you go, oh, that's cool. I wish I could have been the one to help him. I wish I could have been there in that time. And we miss the opportunities of what God is doing when we fail to act. A couple of stocks or movers here in the last few years. There's been a lot of talk about things like Bitcoin or Tesla. And I remember when I was in college, actually I just graduated from college, a few of my buddies were talking about Bitcoin. Hey man, you should buy some Bitcoin. Why do I want digital money? That makes no sense. It was like a couple of bucks a piece for Bitcoin. I go, no, that's silly. I'm not doing that. And if you follow Bitcoin at all, it's somewhere around $40,000 per Bitcoin now. And you go, well, if I would have known now what I knew then, I would have bought a few Bitcoin and then sold them now for 40 grand a piece, right? If there's some way that could happen, if I could go back and do it again, that'd be a pretty brilliant financial move. But I still have no Bitcoin because I'm not gonna take that kind of risk. Or Tesla. I mean, maybe you've heard about that one recently. The stock's going all over, but mostly climbing. There was a point a few years ago, a bunch of my friends and people were saying, oh man, Tesla, yeah, you should invest in Tesla. That's too risky for me. Too risky for me. I looked at it. I remember specifically one day I go, well, all right, it's selling for $200 a stock. Man, that's kind of a lot. I think it's kind of overvalued. I'm just going to stay with some safer things. And the next day it jumped to $350. I went, wow, missed that one. Well, now it's way overvalued. And it continued to climb. And after a 5-to-1 split, it's now $860 per one. So that means if I were to put that $200 in at that point, it's $4,300 now by comparison. And you go, that's not a chance you get to make again. There's always a risk. And in those two instances, I went, the risk seems too great. And now I can look, I can graph it and go, wow, look what I missed out on. Now, As we look to the future and we talk about this new building and the opportunities that God will have to work in our community, that our church can connect in our community in ways that we have not been able to in the past, there are no graphs. There are no charts about what we miss if we do not take this step. There is nothing that you can look back on and go, wow, I was sacrificially involved in seeing this happen, and God did this. Or I was not, and man, look what I missed. There's no chart. There's no graph. There's no visual that we can go back and look at and say, we missed it. But God is still at work. And if I can learn something from the example of Mordecai, it's this, that when we're not involved in what God is doing, God still works, but we just miss what he's doing. We're not involved in it. We're not a part of it. God will still accomplish his goals. God will still save those he will save. He will still grow those he's working to grow, and others will go, and we simply miss our opportunity to be involved in what God is doing in our world. Stephen Hogan says this, most people miss great opportunities because of their misperception of time. Don't wait. The time will never be just right. You ever said that? Need the time to be, time's just not quite right now. You know, the conditions weren't quite right for this conversation, for this investment, for whatever it is that we're going through. We don't want to miss, as a church, the opportunity to impact our community for the name of Christ. We want to be a church that builds bridges to our community, that connects with people who are near and far from Christ, and who leave a lasting legacy in our world for the name and sake of Jesus Christ, so that people can know Jesus, so that people can grow to follow him, and so that people can go help others to do the same. And so I'll go back to verse 14. Mordecai says, if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place. But you, your father's family, will perish. You'll miss the opportunity to be involved in what God is doing. God will still work, but you'll miss it. He goes on to say, and who knows but that you have come to royal position for such a time as this. Says Esther, you just happen to be the queen. You just happen to be the one out of the many that the king chose to be his queen. It just so happens that it's you. And it just so happens that I'm letting you know about a problem. It just so happens that there is a problem that includes you. And you could look at taking action and go, it's risky. It's dangerous. I don't know if I want to do that. And you could say, maybe I'll just avoid it and it'll pass by and someone else can do it. And Mordecai says, yeah, but you'll miss out on being involved in what God is doing. And stop for a second and think, Esther. Maybe, just maybe, the entire reason that you are where you are, who you are, with the connections you have now is because God put you there for a reason. And the reason is this. What if, as we look to the future, that's part of why we're here too? That God has put us here so that we can know Jesus. God has put us here so we can help others to grow to follow him. God has put us as a church and us as individuals here so that we can go multiply followers of Christ. What if? Who knows? But that you have come to this position, this time, this place for such a time as this. What if we're here now so we can take a risk for the sake of others as well? Not to save a group of people from execution, but to rescue people who are near and people who are far with the life-saving and the life-transforming message of Jesus, shared from the pulpit, shared from a small group, shared from a game room, shared in your living room, and shared in a new gym and multi-purpose building. What if it looks like a financial step now, but it looks very, very different from that in the years ahead? What if we're here like Esther was there to participate in what God will one day do? And what if we're here for such a time as this so that we can look back on and say, I was involved and I answered God's call? Now, Esther responds to Mordecai. This response, she says, go, gather together all the Jews who are in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day, and I and my maids will fast as you do. When this is done, I will go to the king, and even though it is against the law, and if I perish, I perish. Esther says, begin with prayer. See, that's the primary point of fasting. In the times in the past where I have fasted, it's an indication that you take the time where you would normally eat breakfast or lunch or dinner, and instead of eating or preparing breakfast, lunch, or dinner, you set that time aside for whether it's reading your Bible or whether it's prayer in a specific area or topic. And when you're hungry, it's supposed to remind you to pray about the problem going on. And so Esther and the people in her day say, for 3 days, we are not going to have these meal times, and we're going to dedicate these times instead to prayer. And every time that we're reminded we're hungry, we're going to say, God, we need your help in this circumstance. And so for 3 days, they said, we are going to do nothing but pray about and look to the future and say, God, we need your help. And once this has been fully bathed in prayer, then with God's help, I will obediently and courageously act in a risky circumstance, but leave the results to him. What if we also, as we look to the future and say this building is a big daunting prospect, begin with prayer? See, I believe as Mordecai and Esther here recognize that prayer is the first and most crucial step. And that's why for the last months and years we've been praying about God's help. That's why we started with the 21-day spiritual journey, because we want for 21 days everybody, as we start this, to be praying, to be in God's Word together, to say, God, we could do our own little thing here, but we don't want to do our own little thing here. We want to do your thing, and we want your help, and we need your help if this is going to go well, if this is going to be accomplished for you and for your purposes. That's why next week we're having a special event in connection to this called the Prayer in Between. There's a notification about that in your bulletins that will remind you about that. But that's between our services next Sunday, between the 9 and 10:30 services. At about 10 o'clock, we're going to be getting together outside in that space where the new building will be, so we can gather together and do what Mordecai, Esther, and the people of her day did and pray about what is coming, knowing that it is what God will do, not what I or you or we will do. We start with prayer. Then we take a step of faith, trusting God for the results. And the story of Esther goes on to say that King Xerxes extended that golden scepter after those 3 days of fasting and prayer, and she was allowed to come to his presence. She invited him and Haman to a meal. And she had just those two there. In fact, she invited them a second time for a meal. And finally, the king is like, what's going on? Why are you having me over for all these meals? What do you really want? I'll give you whatever you want. And she says, I want my people. I want rescue. We have been sentenced to death by this Haman right here. And the king is upset by this, steps out of the room. And when he steps back in, Haman is kind of falling on her, begging her for forgiveness. And he goes, you're assaulting my wife. Off to the gallows with you. And he discovered that Haman had built gallows for Mordecai, and Mordecai was not the one to hang on these gallows, but Haman was. Behind the scenes, we discover that God was at work. You see, the night before the king had this meal with Esther, he couldn't sleep. And it just so happens that he asked for the records to be read to him. You know, some good, boring reading material to make him go to sleep. And it just so happens that as they're reading the records, they read about this Mordecai thwarting a plot to save the king. And the king just so happens to ask if anything was done to save this, to reward this Mordecai. And they said no. And so Mordecai was rewarded on the very day that it just so happens that Haman wanted him dead, and they went to eat with Esther, and she uncovers and declares what Haman wanted to do against her and her people. Now, the king issues another decree in which the Jews would be able to be rescued and delivered from the death that was planned for them in their future. And the people of Israel in that day were saved because of a group of people who was willing to take a risk, who began with prayer and who answered the call of God. And say, what if she'd said no? What if she didn't speak up? What if she did not approach the king? Well, I think just as Mordecai said, that God would have done something in some other way, but there would have been no book of Esther in our Bibles. There'd be no day of Purim to be celebrated. Esther would have been safe for a while, but ultimately forgotten to history. You and I have a chance to be remembered not for our greatness, but for our obedience and our sacrifice for the sake of others each and every day. And as we look towards this new building, we have opportunities as well, not to get our name in a book or name on a wall, but to be a part of a group that we can look back on one day and said, those people answered the call of God, and things are happening here and now because of their obedience then. What if you and I are here for such a time as this? So as we look to the future, I want to encourage us. I want to challenge us. We go to the next slide. My clicker died or something. First of all, let's begin with prayer. Just as Esther, just as Mordecai, just as they gathered and said, for 3 days we are going to do nothing but pray. We want to encourage and challenge you to join us in praying. Maybe you've already started last week, you were with us, or you caught up online and you've been a part of the 21-day spiritual journey. I want to encourage you to continue as we work into week 2 and week 3. If you are seeing this for the first time, I want to encourage you to jump in and join us. Go ahead and just start out on day 1. It's pretty self-explanatory, but as you go through, there's a verse, there's a thought, there's an application, there's a prompt to pray. As week 1, we talk about know. Week 2, we talk about grow. And week 3, we talk about go. I think it's critical that we begin with prayer. I invite you to join us for a prayer walk next Sunday, few minutes after this service, and beside the gravel lot at 10 o'clock. And then as we look to the future, I want to encourage you to be prepared. Start with prayer, and then prepare to risk, to make a sacrifice in some way of something that you could use for you, that you can instead say, God, how are you going to use this space for your name, for this community, for future generations? See, there is good news that we celebrate every week of the life-changing message of Jesus Christ. And we are excited about being able to have this celebration happen here on Sundays, Mondays, Tuesdays, Wednesdays, throughout the week. But also, we're excited about greater impact in this community. Not in being a big church, but in being a church with a big impact. And so next week is our Commitment Sunday, where if you've been praying, hopefully you've been praying and spending time to say, how's God been leading me? My challenge to you is simply this: do what God says for you. No one's going to guilt you. No one's going to prompt you. No one says you have to do this or you have to do that. You start with prayer, and you do what God asks you to do. I close with a simple question. What if we're here, like Esther was there, for such a time as this? For this moment, for this time. For God to use us, not some other person, not some other church, not some other group, but you and I to impact and interact with the lives in our community. For this generation, with an impact not just in this place and in this time, but beyond it, for the name of Jesus. We want to be a church, and I want to be a person who doesn't just say, what if God does something around here, but what if God can use me? What if God can use you? Join me in prayer.